Hey everybody, it's Erik Torenberg, co-founder, partner of Village Global, a network-driven venture firm. And this is Venture Stories, a podcast covering topics relating to tech and business with world-leading experts. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Venture Stories by Village Global. I'm here today with two very special guests, Pete Flint of NFX and Alex Taussig of Lightspeed. Alex, Pete, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks. Great to be here.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, guys, I want to give a little bit of the backstory of why we're doing this episode in the first place. Pete, Alex, what do you guys have in common or shared interest that brings us here today?
So I guess the catalyst, Alex and I have been sort of bouncing ideas off each other for a while around like the kind of intersection of financial services and marketplaces. And then at NFX, I published an article earlier this year, which we called fintech-enabled marketplaces. And I just know from our internal data, this was like, I think one of the most popular articles we've ever written, and it resonated with a whole bunch of people. And then, and Alex and I kind of rekindled a conversation about that. And I guess kind of that's here we are. Is that same your recollection as well, Alex?
Yeah, Pete, that is my recollection. I think from two different directions, you and I kind of stumbled upon a similar trend that we were seeing in the marketplace, both of us spending a decent amount of time on marketplace businesses. And I know on our end, we've been thinking a lot about the evolution of online marketplaces. And the thing that I kind of observed was that, the newer ones just need to take more risk to create liquidity than they did before. They need to do more work and they need to actually centralize risk on their platform. And, I think that necessitates often creating a financial services business in the middle. So it's an interesting hybrid business model. And I think we could talk through a few examples of that.
Yeah, let's get into that. So let's start from the beginning. Why do marketplaces have to take more risks? And what does that mean practically? And why are we seeing this?
I think it's, to start, just a function of where we're at in the evolution of the technology cycle. When applications that were consumer-facing first started to arise on the internet, the first marketplaces were like eBay or Craigslist, maybe, if you're thinking about listings. And these were simple places where buyers and sellers could just connect with one another. And if you look at eBay at its IPO, it had roughly a 6% take rate, 90% gross margins, and positive net income when it went public. So, with those economics, you get the sense that it was kind of just skimming from the top. If you compare that to Lyft, for example, a marketplace business which went public recently, this is a business with 46% contribution margin, so a lot lower. The difference between that and something like eBay is there's a ton of extra technology, extra payments, fraud, insurance, all sorts of stuff that they have to do to enable that marketplace to exist. But in exchange, Lyft has a 26% take rate, so much higher. And if you looked at it on a equal dollars of GMV basis, Lyft extracts about twice the profit from a transaction than eBay does for the same amount of bookings. So what we saw over those couple decades is marketplaces that just are doing more work to create higher take rate and create liquidity. And all I'm saying is the next wave of that, the other work that has to be done for the next wave of marketplaces is to really take on the risk and take that away from both sides and centralize it. And I think one of the first examples of this might have been Airbnb itself. When they announced that they were going to give insurance to hosts in case the guests wrecked their place, well, that opened up a lot more liquidity because it made hosts more open to listing their place on the website. And there's a number of other examples now that are looking more like financial services businesses, which we can get into if you like.
I think just from a first principles perspective, you look at marketplaces, really they have, as the case in many businesses, there are really two kind of imperatives that they have. The first is obviously improving the end user experience. And the second is increasing their take rate or their value capture. And so from just that first principle perspective, that has guided so much of marketplace evolution. It's manifested itself in a number of different themes. So the sort of verticalization, or that some people have sort of called it the sort of splintering of Craigslist. So natural verticalization of kind of these horizontal platforms, or call it generalist platforms, into vertical specific versions. And going full stack, enables them to improve that experience, but often also, which is equally important, is capturing more of the transaction. You've also seen it in mobilization, which is again a kind of putting a product to where the consumers like to use that product experience. And so you've seen this, whether it's the kind of mobile version of a kind of, a pre-existing service or a full stack version of a pre-existing service, there is this kind of inordinate rise and frankly unstoppable rise to improve the consumer experience and improve the number of the dollars you capture from that transaction. And then you look at where the kind of like large greenfield opportunities that exist within the internet today, financial services come screaming kind of like front and center saying, well, this is a terrible user experience for most people that interact with it. Huge amounts of friction, particularly when you have multi-party transactions, whether that's kind of insurance for a homeowner that wants to rent it out, or a prospective home buyer that wants to purchase a property, or a small business that wants to get something done. Like these multi-party transactions they're terrible. There's huge amounts of kind of inefficiency and cost in that. And so, one phrase that we like is the money's in the money. So the money's in the money, and you're applying that on top of this kind of incredible business model, which is marketplace, and the network effects that come out of that means that we think the kind of next wave of these enormous marketplace businesses will be this blend between marketplace and financial services. And I think it's, one way to look at it is risk, but you can think of risk broadly defined. I think you look at where the core financial services products exist, whether that's insurance, that's banking, that's financing and lending, like all of those are kind of in the business of managing risk, but they all are kind of crappy businesses that have been designed in these quite horizontal contexts. You see in these industries that massive horizontal insurance providers or banking providers, and they really have lost sight of their own consumer. So this is kind of where we see a whole range of new startups emerging and that we think are going to be transformative in their user experience, enables them to unlock value in a way that attract consumers away from perhaps an incumbent, just in the way that Airbnb did back in its day, and then also capture huge amounts of value, enabling them to build these sustainable independent entities.
What are examples of these startups that are emerging, or what might they look like?
I could give you one example from our own portfolio, and that's a company called Fair, F-A-I-R-E. So the founders of Fair were actually at Square before they started the company, and they were very interested in small business. And in particular, in the U.S., there's a long tail of about 1 million small retailers, call it $1 million in revenue or less. These retailers have largely bought stuff for their stores through an old school trade show network or sales agents who take a big chunk of the transaction. So these stores are all over the place. It's on any main street here in San Francisco. Maybe you're walking down Valencia Street, and to your left and to your right, you'll see a lot of these stores. So the question is, we're in the age of, eBay and Amazon and all these things. Well, why are these guys not transacting online? And the reason they figured out was that retailers fundamentally are risk averse when they're small businesses. Because if you buy a bunch of inventory and it doesn't sell, you're stuck with it. You have no resale channel. You have no way to liquidate. You can't usually return it to the manufacturer. So they just don't try new stuff as often as they probably should. So Fair tried this experiment where they said, well, what if we guarantee the item will sell, or we'll take it back, and then we'll extend you net 60 payment terms on that inventory. And what happened was, for the first time, a lot of these retailers started trying new makers. And they noticed that some of these new makers were selling. Fair then used that data to power an algorithm that drove recommendations of other things those people should buy, because it turns out once you have tens of thousands of retailers and thousands of brands on your platform, you can start doing a lot of pairwise matching using data science. And so they ended up creating this data asset that drove more sales and created this flywheel. And so it's a good example of kind of a financial innovation. In some ways, it almost looks like they're lending inventory to see if it sells. But on the back end, they actually are in a better position than any other market participant to determine what's going to sell in what store. So it looks like a lending business where we're effectively underwriting inventory to these retailers. And it's the thing that created liquidity. This market's close to $1 trillion of GMV, but no one's touched it in the US because no one's been able to figure out how to get liquidity in it until now.
Another example from industry I'm familiar with is the real estate industry. If you look at the evolution of the online real estate industry on the purchase side, you've seen this evolution from perhaps traditional listing companies through to the launch of Trulia and Zillow. I was the founder and CEO of Trulia for many years, so that was our pitch 15 years ago. It was like, these are terrible user experience, and we wanted to innovate on the user experience initially. And then you've seen Redfin evolve the transaction, and more recently, Open Door, Zillow offers, and a company we invest in called Ribbon, which is helping you buy your home before you kind of sell your previous home. You could think of it like bridge financing in some way. You're connecting in all these kind of most recent companies. They've raised large amounts of debt capital to facilitate transactions, give you a transformative user experience in a kind of really complex and stressful transaction. And I think I was on the Zillow board where when kind of there was initial evaluation around the sort of the cash transaction model and the extensive research trying to figure it out. And the thing that became sort of loud and clear, which has since been talked about, is that there was, from a consumer perspective, there is a high productivity to spend to get a better user experience. And I think this is apparent to many of us, whether that's taking Uber Black or whether if it's available and it's convenient, people will spend a lot of money for a great end consumer experience, which is, I think defies a lot of the conventional wisdom about these kind of big ticket items that you're not willing to spend, whatever the 6 to 10% fee that these companies are providing. And it turns out there is a large and growing portion of the population that will pay for that convenience. So, the size of the asset class that is real estate enables this model to evolve and to have. And now you look at the kind of big companies in the space, Open Door, Zillow Group, Redfin, they're all experimenting with financing meets transaction, meets marketplace, some flavor of that. And it's completely transformed that industry, or set to completely transform that industry over the next few years. Same in the kind of rental industry, you're seeing that happening. And I think perhaps, to bring it up to today's day, if you think of marketplaces generally and you think about this sort of relentless drive to integrate financial services into a marketplace, the announcement of Facebook and Libra is exactly a fintech-enabled marketplace. This is kind of like there is inevitability about connecting participants, whether that's sort of social commerce, but also you've got, Facebook's marketplace, you've got WhatsApp, trying to figure out how to monetize that. They're absolutely deeply integrating financial services product into a kind of marketplace dynamic. And they're using the trust and data layer that they've built up and the relationships in the sort of traditional marketplace and implementing this financial services product, which is ultimately what it is, into that, which creates huge utility for a portion of that, their target audience. And I'm sure they'll be able to figure out a way to make a lot of money from it. And so I think the blockchain component is kind of relevant, but also irrelevant as well. So as I was saying, kind of Apple launching the Apple Card, deeply integrating an Apple a financial services product into a two-sided platform creates great utility for them and monetization. So I think this is going to be, incumbents are going to incorporate it. Many will fail, but also new startups will implement this and create breakthrough experiences or give them the economic base to create significant value.
That's a great example, several great examples. Another one that I think is worth paying attention to is not really I don't think by strict definition of marketplace business, but if you look at any of these online schools that are offering income sharing agreements, you're also starting to see a shift towards centralizing risk. And so if you think about what an income sharing agreement is fundamentally, it's transitioning the financial burden for figuring out if this student is going to make it from the student predominantly to the platform. So when you say, I'm going to take 10% of your first year's income as my compensation, you are taking risk for the student who you paid for to acquire as a customer, and then you paid for to run through your program, and take a risk on representing them to your hiring partners is going to perform at that job. So effectively, you're almost like underwriting that student with your admissions criteria. And it's a really good thing, actually, if you think about it, because you're effectively aligning in a really concrete way the outcome of the institution with the student by focusing on the income sharing. There's also ways you can go wrong, but I think that idea of like looking at the educational institution as an underwriting body and underwriting on admissions is something that could really transform education and get a lot more people into educational institutions than those who would previously have had to go either pay for themselves or go borrow and go into debt. And as we all know, the student debt crisis is just massive in this country. So I kind of think that's almost a financial innovation that we'll start to see at the center of education marketplaces.
For a few of these examples, let's say, Lambda, Fair, Ribbon, what's the why now? Like, why couldn't these marketplaces be enabled 5 years ago, or why not 5 years from now?
Well, I think there are a number of kind of key catalysts right now. So one is that consumer experiences are changing. Like I said, around the kind of Zillow open door experience, people will pay for convenience, and they're used to it. Let's face it, we're used to, pressing a few buttons and we can reserve a treehouse in South Africa just like that. It's remarkable. Yet if I want to kind of purchase a car, or I want to purchase a home, or, if I'm a small business want to do something, it's incredibly complex. So you just get your tolerance for friction is changed dramatically. Two is that you already got money flowing through these marketplaces. So you've got people comfortable with online commerce, and you've got pre-existing marketplaces, whether it's Apple, they've bought your cards, or with Facebook, we've got credit cards there, or whether it's a sort of Airbnb where you've got money flowing through the system. Three is the sort of aggregation of data and the sophistication of the machine learning. The machine learning doesn't always start out complex, but over time in competitive markets, it necessarily has to be more complex. You've got kind of machine learning and AI and data availability centralized. It gives you a kind of a view on that. And then fourth is broadly the availability of capital and the financial infrastructure to enable this. There are companies that provide ISA services to other participants. There's Stripe, there's Play, there's a number of other the kind of infrastructure pieces that have been put in place, plus just an availability of capital. Like, this is to manage risk, you obviously need to have kind of sort of scalable financial infrastructure to manage that. And that we're in a kind of pretty good period for that. Plus there's a recognition that kind of software is permeating everything we do, and there's significant capital which is going to back great ideas and great businesses.
I think those are all great why nows, and I just add one more to the list, which is to say that it wasn't usually the case that tech startups needed to think about raising tons of debt to finance these types of business models. That wasn't a thing that was very common until about 10 years ago, when you saw the initial kind of cohort of these businesses starting to get built. And then you had people who came out of the banking, private equity world, financial services world, who came into startups and built up, what are really capital markets and risk functions in those businesses. And now they're all onto their second or third companies doing this role. So we've seen kind of the capital markets chief risk officer role rise up, and you kind of need that function, and it previously didn't exist. As a good example, we're investors in a company called Affirm, and our chief risk officer was previously the chief credit officer at Lending Club, which was one of the Gen 1 companies, and prior to that he was at Capital One. So I think you're starting to see the core competency of underwriting come to more of these marketplace-like businesses. And that's a very important thing, because it's really the profit driver.
And really on a global scale, we invested in Audi, which is sort of the Affirm for Latin America. You're starting to see these global equivalents pop up. How broad will this trend go? Like, do you think this will work in healthcare, for example? We just talked about education with Lambda, but how about healthcare? And what do you think about some other categories where it might be tougher?
I think it's all about finding the application area in healthcare that, for example, and we're just talking about healthcare, but if you think about healthcare, there's a ton of different places where you might apply logic to this. You could look at it in, the renting of equipment, or the purchasing of consumables in hospitals, or you could look at it for healthcare staffing. In each of those cases, you can think about how, between marketplace participants, the platform can take on more risk to enable liquidity. And in some cases, it might not be that valuable. In other cases, it might be more. So it's really it's hard to paint with a too broad a brush, but my view is it requires a very deep understanding of the industry. I don't think FAIR could have been started had Max and Daniele and Marcelo had not spent 5 years inside of Square grappling with the problems of these small businesses. They tend to come out of these very, very specific jobs because it's all about the dynamics of that particular market.
We talked about a little bit of the opportunities around these businesses, but Alex touches on a point, which is the necessary complexity, and often the founding DNA of the team is particularly important. Like, because you have got to blend this kind of like incredible product instincts that gives you a large, whether it's consumer or SMB, or you've got to have incredible product instincts to have a breakthrough value proposition, because the bar is getting increasingly higher. Plus, you've often got a sophisticated machine learning or statistical or analytical capability to kind of manage the risk profile. Plus, you've got to be a credible kind of partner to the capital markets or debt providers. Plus, you've got to be thoughtful and sensitive about the regulatory environment and industry participants for these massive opportunities. It doesn't need to be there day one. It's a rare DNA to be able to navigate those experiences. And we've moved on from 2 founders and a mobile app. Like, it's so much harder to kind of build these businesses, but the opportunity is that much greater. To go back to your thing about medical, the healthcare industry, I absolutely think so. I'm very hopeful. I think you started to see, when you look at, if you sort of break down, okay, banking, financial services, insurance, like healthcare is just, healthcare insurance is just an enormous industry.
Yeah.
And in the same way we talked about that Lambda School has innovated on the education side to provide greater alignment between the different participants, and that hopefully will come out to greater outcomes. Obviously there's some societal kind of conversations about kind of that model, but regardless, I think you've got to have this deep alignment between participants. Anyone that's kind of spent time in the US understands the deep misalignment often between participants in the healthcare industry. We've got competing priorities. And so if there is and you're starting to see elements of this in certain therapeutics where there's kind of deeper alignment in the business model, more outcome-based, as in the case of Lambda School, which is, gets dramatic traction with employers. And obviously they've got an sort of imperative and incentive to kind of create a great product at the end of the day. Yeah. So I absolutely think it will come. There's this chart which, many people, spread quite virally on the internet, which is really about the kind of nominal value increase of various different products or services over the last 20 plus years. Whether, and you've seen cars, the sort of price per cars come down, TVs come down, software come down, but you've seen student student textbook, and certainly kind of the healthcare industry go up dramatically.
I think construction too.
Yeah. And it's like, I think there is deep misalignment, and there's also obviously a bunch of regulatory kind of capture in there. Regulation is harder to change, but it will be nibbled away at the edges and certain areas. So I'm hopeful, but it takes a special kind of entrepreneur to go through the brain damage of some of these businesses in the healthcare industry.
Are you guys doing much in these regulated market, education or healthcare or construction, Alex, perhaps?
Well, we're certainly looking at a lot of them. I think every industry has its own peculiarities, and you really do have to kind of lean into the entrepreneur and hear what their insight is in terms of how the market is structured and how a marketplace can function and where the value capture comes from. So I don't rule anything out. I think the only thing I would say is, because your initial question was where does this not work, the things that I've kind of tended to steer away from tended to be where you have consolidation on one side of the marketplace or the other. And so a good example of that would be something like food services. So, restaurants buy tons of produce every year of all sorts of different types, but it's hard to build a marketplace in there because you have a very fragmented base of restaurants, but then you have a very consolidated base of suppliers because food needs to be warehoused. And so these firms that warehouse it often break bulk and deliver to those restaurants. Let's think of Cisco or US Foods. And so if you have really 3 marketplace participants on the supply side and a whole bunch of restaurants, you'll never really be able to have leverage on the supply side. So I think this concept works the best when you have very fragmented supply and demand. And that's also when the sort of the financing aspect creates the most value, because it turns out both of those parties don't lack the scale to be able to take their own risk. So that's probably the one area I would say is predictive of, I wouldn't say failure, but just difficulty.
Ben Thompson had this from Stratechery had this great post recently, or maybe a while ago, about Zillow and Opendoor, and that it was sort of thesis was that it's not enough just to be an aggregator for lead gen, but you had to be involved in the transaction somehow. It's a different but related topic to what we're talking about now about these sort of integrated marketplaces. I'm curious for areas in which that hasn't worked as well, perhaps social, like Facebook is doing. We were just talking about Libra, but they've tried payments and Messenger before. Conversational commerce was a thing for a bit. Twitter certainly thought about it. I'm curious why it hasn't worked in these places, and if you think it will. And maybe media is another way. Products on what I was building or helping build was certainly thinking about sort of the integration of media and commerce. And we, besides I guess Pinterest, we haven't really seen that take off in any big way. Lightspeed is in BuzzFeed and Cheddar and a bunch of other media stuff. But how do you think about some of those ideas?
I think I would say that it's sort of happening. It's not happening, but it is happening. I think where you're trying to remove friction, then, and we talked about just some media examples like Instagram and the shopping cart and like payments is like, it's happening. Like Instagram is like going to become a sort of, one of the largest e-commerce companies in the world. Today it's starting with a kind of providing sort of lead generation and then, moving into the shopping cart. So where there's a sort of strong consumer or customer need, and just like anything, trying to change consumer behavior with an incremental product is often pretty hard to do. But when you start to kind of build remove significant amounts of friction, then it can create it can break through. And the mobile phone creates enormous friction for kind of payments and multi-party transactions, which is a huge catalyst for kind of making some of these things happen.
So we looked at a lot of these quote unquote conversational commerce companies a few years ago, and I would say the frequency of them has declined in the last few years. And I think there are two big problems with most of those companies. One is I'm not sure it's the product experience most people want. So when you type a search into Amazon, it doesn't just return you one result. You actually want to scroll through listings and give your own opinion on the particular item you want to buy. You want to look at a bunch of different listings. It's not a linear experience. It's a multi-step experience. So it turns out that that's how most buying behavior is. And there's very few things where you want to ask a question and get the one thing you want to buy. And by the way, those use cases I think are more commodity and probably things you've already bought before. So it's more of a reordering behavior. But the challenge with any new company is you can't just bootstrap a company on reordering, because that customer has to start somewhere. So, I think Amazon's probably in the best position to offer compelling conversational commerce service through Alexa. One, because it owns the voice platform, but two, because you have order history with it. And that was just a tricky thing structurally for startups to contend with. The second piece is just where we are with regards to natural language processing, or where we were, I would say, with natural language processing 3 years ago. Because it's gotten a lot better, but it's still not good enough to purely work on an algorithmic basis for a general inquiry. And so startups had to choose between having a kind of automated product experience that was relatively low cost because it didn't involve humans, but was kind of crappy for the user, or they could substitute with humans, but then the cost structure didn't support a sort of a consumer app. And so these businesses did not have good gross margins and were not able to scale. So you had on one side a product issue, on the other side a business model issue. And that's why I think most of these businesses didn't end up working out. Interestingly, we've actually seen this work better in the enterprise. So we're investors in a company called TripActions. And TripActions provides a consumer-like experience for booking and managing your travel as a business user. And it's effectively has travel agents on the other end that are kind of helping you rebook flights and move hotels and doing all the things that are kind of a headache for you as a consumer, but they can do on the back end. And, that's a business with very healthy gross margins. But because it's serving enterprises, they can charge, a lot more. And because it's business customers, the value of these trips is a lot higher. So we just haven't seen it work out, I think, for a variety of reasons on the consumer side.
How do you think about in sectors that might seem too niche? For example, you guys at Lightspeed did Zola. You wouldn't necessarily think the wedding industry is right for a unicorn, whereas other fields like Lux and sort of valet parking didn't necessarily work out. How do you think about areas that might seem niche and might versus the ones that are actually niche and won't grow?
Well, weddings only seem niche until you get married, and then you realize how much they cost. So the wedding industry is $100 billion just in the US. About 19 billion of that is registry. So it's actually quite a large business. I think the reason people have kind of poo-pooed it for a long time is that the biggest company in the space for maybe 15 years was the Knot. And that was a couple $100 million a year business and basically flat. The real issue historically was that the only way you'd make money in weddings was through advertising. But if there's only 2 or 3 million couples a year that get married. So if you're advertising to 2 or 3 million people, that's not a huge market for advertising. But if you can somehow get in the transaction flow, Erik, as you mentioned, you can access a much bigger pool of spending. And so Zola started as a gift registry. And, the why now with them was prior to, say, 2013, you really couldn't drop ship any of the types of items people get on their gift registry to a customer because not a lot of those brands were online yet. But when they all started coming online, the founders of Zola realized that they could push the inventory risk back onto the vendors because they had such a long timeline between when the couple said, this is what I want, and when the brands had to ship it. And so if they could give with good predictive accuracy, I know exactly how many Cuisinarts I need, the brand's willing to take that risk. And the reason that's important is with home goods, the inventory costs are so high and they don't move very often. So previously, only department stores could have gift registries. But now with dropship, Zola can build the first independent registry. So that thing took off. The registry product was a huge success. It's hard to go to a wedding now and not have someone use Zola for their registry. But then what they realized was, well, this registry is really the gateway to the rest of the wedding. So we're also going to be able to bundle in your website, all your invitations and paper goods, and a variety of other things you'll see coming out. But effectively, the goal is to use that registry as a way to drive a wedge into the wedding industry and capture potentially that $100 billion of spend on a single platform. So I think it's in a stark contrast to the macro trend in that sector. And again, people look at department stores and they say, what a horrible business to be in. And it's true, it's been declining at about 3% a year for the last 16 years. But it turns out that the fact that Amazon has decimated these department stores and really eaten their use case is kind of a good thing for Zola, because while they're encumbered with their core business and can't focus on registry, it's kind of all Zola did for the first 3 to 4 years. So they can be really good at it.
It's, the way that you frame, from an investor perspective and a founder perspective, if you can reframe the TAM, going from kind of advertising or marketing fee into basically the entire money flow within the system, then while your likely gross margins can be lower, the TAM becomes substantially bigger kind of overnight. And you see companies entering this market. You see, Airbnb is fascinating in terms of, their transition from being purely a transactional marketplace into, investing in and acquiring a number of supply side full service operators, and effectively investors in Lyft, for instance. It's like, there's a ton of supply on Airbnb, and that's the distribution platform. But the TAM that Lyft operates is, an order of magnitude bigger than you would have conceived of those sort of businesses a while ago. And so this opens up, there's obviously rules of thumb that various investors have around what's the TAM I need to look for. But as soon as you start to kind of take over the user experience, take over the money flow, then seemingly niche businesses, whether that's, short-term stays or corporate housing or kind of other services, start to become these very venture backable businesses that look really interesting.
We were talking about income share agreements a bit earlier as it relates to education, a little bit to healthcare. How big do you think that sort of
financial instrument will be? Like how many sectors will it penetrate? How all encompassing will it be, or will it be more of a niche thing applied to certain industries? Like what, unicorns will be built based on that, sort of innovation?
I haven't really made it past the education use case right now, because for me, that's such a big market. And clearly it's a market that's in crisis. There's a real reskilling that needs to happen for a big chunk of the economy as we move towards a service economy in the 21st century. And it's pretty clear that like taking a bunch of debt from the federal government is not the right way to finance that. It hasn't aligned incentives in the last 30 years, and it's probably not going to align them in the next 30 years. So what's yet to be seen is what the performance of this new crop of companies is. And, this is an innovation that really started in the universities, but has really morphed into being used at even greater scale by these sort of next gen vocational schools like Lambda. So, we're just going to have to see what the performance looks like. I get a little worried when I see that some companies are selling off their book of ISAs to third parties to manage them. And what that means effectively is, you have this capital risk that the person's maybe not going to perform at their job. And so there's some investors out there who will buy a basket of these ISAs at some discounted price, which allows a school like a Lambda to just take that money in a lump sum up front. The challenge with that is it's a little bit like the mortgage origination crisis, where you had people getting paid for origination but not holding the mortgage on their own balance sheet. Now they're no longer aligned with the user. So I do worry that too much of that will sort of spoil the market. But by and large, I think with the right structures and guide rails in place, it could be a much better way to incentivize people to get a good education that's going to generate a salary increase, which is ultimately, I think, what a lot of people want.
I think what we've, in the evolution of the internet and other industries, you've seen how, a business model innovation is rarely a sustainable lead. It's everything else beyond that. Selling stuff online, it's kind of was a business model innovation, but kind of rarely sufficient to maintain a competitive advantage. So whether that's in the form of, essentially it means adding other defensibilities, whether that's the form of brand. Stanford, Harvard are kind of, as educational institutions, have created phenomenal brands that are incredibly defensible and they're not going to be disrupted by ISAs in the foreseeable future, whether that's network effects, whether that's other forms of defensibility and embedding. So the business model is likely kind of necessary, but not sufficient. And so it's like in that industry itself is like, what can you build on top of that? What can you build on top of that? And the companies that do that effectively will be the ones that are going to be sustainable. That's market specifically is I think there were some questions around like how broadly translatable it is into other kind of vocations other than software. And I think largely absolutely. And whether that can be taken by one company or whether that will be splintering that product proposition across multiple companies. And then you look at the sort of international opportunity, which is human capital is mobile, and then different countries pay vastly different amounts for education, whether that's because they're government supported or whether that's culturally important for segments of the population. But as an opportunity to drive global GDP, I think it's pretty significant on the whole scheme of things what that can do.
Let's close with what are your requests for startups in this space? What are you most excited to see? Where you think there's most opportunity for white space, or you think people just haven't really done well yet?
Well, I kind of think that the sort of financial services enabled marketplaces that I'm most excited to see are the ones that target small businesses. That's not to say that consumer-facing ones won't be interesting either, but I think the need is really large in sort of what I call micro firms. There's about 20 million Americans that work in small businesses with fewer than 20 employees. The average is about 4 employees or less. Because they don't act like enterprises, they don't have like a staff to evaluate pieces of software that are sitting in front of them. So they're more likely to participate in software that enables them to buy things they need for their business. And that software will tend to be spread more like consumer product than like enterprise software. So what that looks like is maybe the categories like professional services. I do think construction is one of these massive categories that's going to see one of these. There are certain sort of verticals of healthcare, I think, where you can find an insertion point. For example, medical staffing is a big one. Fair, as I said, is executing this playbook in retail. And while I'm not necessarily excited about sort of the restaurant food purchasing vertical, I do think there is something that's going to work in the food supply chain for this, because again, it's such a massive thing with so much waste. So I would really just look at almost any small business vertical where you have massive fragmentation on both sides. Think about what is being purchased, and then where can you alleviate some of the risk aversion by assuming the risk yourself as the platform.
Well, I guess I would, rather than perhaps request to startups, NFX invests at the seed stage, more like request to teams. But I think the nature of the team to tackle these problems is often the most challenging piece. And so, the ingredients of that team, and it, again, doesn't need to be fully formed, but the ingredients of that team is just typically you kind of like to see big markets that don't have too many incumbents in them. But if that's not the case, like, a big market that is sleepy and just ripe for disruption because there's some sort of innovation or observation.
And is that, like, would travel be an example there, or like someone that hasn't had a big player in a while, or what's an example of that?
So what would be? So I mean, I think the education, healthcare could be interesting. I think they've kind of, a lot of people have sort of swings at it, but no one's really kind of done things at a home run basis. The problem with kind of well-developed internet companies is that, let's just take travel. There's like half a dozen kind of companies that are worth $10 billion or more globally. Yeah. Like, if they see an innovation happening from one startup, they'll just deploy 100 engineers overnight and kind of go off of that. So there's, generally kind of big industries that are relatively sleepy, or greenfield opportunities where there's not many sort of tech-enabled incumbents in there. The teams that can both match this deep kind of product sensibility with deep industry understanding, with a kind of appreciation of what it takes to build a kind of financial services layer as part of that. They don't need to be an ex-banker. Hopefully they're not, in fact, but they kind of need some sort of that appreciation of what it takes to kind of build a really powerful, significant player in managing the enormous amounts of commerce that goes through these marketplaces.
Yeah. And last question, where within real estate are you most excited?
Oh, all over. I think, real estate, we touched on it, like construction is kind of a massive opportunity, and it's totally greenfield. There's like advances in computer vision and AI, which will kind of unlock value there. On the real estate side, I think you're still starting to, the sort of online brokerage business is kind of getting more mature, but it's deep in the transaction where, there is still some big opportunities that are kind of relatively untrapped, whether that's title and escrow, that kind of area is quite interesting, which is kind of generally overlooked by the average 20-year-old engineer. And then I think the sort of future of living, that I think it's, unlike perhaps the future of work, which is, WeWork is generally kind of homogeneous experience. You kind of expect predictability. The future of kind of where you live is very heterogeneous. Like, we all want to live in kind of slightly different places. So there's a great productivity to self-expression. And so brands, communities, niche experiences in a massive market, we think are very interesting as well.
Guys, thank you guys for coming on. This has been a great episode. For people who want to learn more or who want to get in touch with your respective firms, where can they learn more? And Pete, sorry.
Yeah, so NFX is a seed fund headquartered in San Francisco. Kind of what makes us unique is that we have 3 GPs that have founded 10 companies with exits of $10 billion, so unique founder DNA. And we are just at nfx.com.
Yeah, and this is Alex. Lightspeed is a $7 billion global venture capital firm. We have offices here in Silicon Valley, as well as in Israel, India, and China. So we invest all over the world in consumer and enterprise technology companies, from seed all the way up through very large growth rounds. And if you want to check us out, you can follow me on Twitter. I'm A Taussig on Twitter. And then I write a weekly newsletter called Drinking from the Fire Hose, which you can sign up for at firehose.vc if you're so inclined.
Yeah, I highly recommend listeners do. And NFX has a lot of great writings on Medium that you should explore. Alex, Pete, thank you both so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks. Great to be here.
Thanks for having me.
If you're an early stage entrepreneur, we'd love to hear from you. Please hit us up at villageglobal.vc/network catalyst.